So our partners, we worked with an NGO called WILD, which works with conservation, and then we also partnered with an ecologist who works in the national park within the city of Mumbai. So that was pretty exciting. So our overarching question that we set out to answer was a big one. What impact does urban agriculture have on ecological connectivity in the city of Mumbai? So first we realized that there's a lot in that question and we really need to unpack it. So we have to kind of look at what is urban agriculture in Mumbai, what does that look like right now, who's practicing it, what does that practice look like? Next we need to ask, what is ecological connectivity? What is ecological connectivity in Mumbai, an extremely dense and growing city? And finally, we needed to identify the level of ecological connectivity within the city of Mumbai and the current and potential influence of urban agriculture in promoting that sort of ecological connectivity. So we're talking about habitat and how well these green spaces are connected via urban agriculture. Just to give you a very brief overview of Mumbai, India, rapidly growing, lots of slum development, lots of tension over land, competition is going on there. Slum redevelopment is a major social issue, and it's expected to grow by several more million in the coming decade. So lots of land issues that we're coming into. The very first question we asked our partner in Mumbai is, we said, okay, you want us to look at ecological connectivity. Ecological connectivity to what end? Because there are a lot of different ways we can measure this. Are we looking at hydrology or biodiversity? And his answer was biodiversity. He works in the national park. He's very committed to making a robust ecological community within that national park. And research indicates that if you have a network within an urban matrix that supports, like a green urban network, that supports that biodiversity within the national park, that can really have major impacts. So we were looking at ecological connectivity for the benefit of biodiversity. What exactly is ecological connectivity? You have two habitat patches. So we have our big national park on the north end of Mumbai, and then we have lots of small green spaces within the city. They're separated by an urban matrix, but there are ways that we can connect these. And in Mumbai, basically we have a stepping stone corridor, So we're looking at how can species, mainly birds and insects, travel between these different spaces. These could be urban agricultural sites. And how can we best do that? And we have to pay attention to this in-between space. What is that matrix? How easy is it for a species to permeate that? And then our reservoir for our big populations would, of course, be the national park. So when we're thinking about increasing connectivity for biodiversity, we have to think about what size are these patches, because we need a variety of size. We need to think about where they are located in relation to one another, and also in relationship to the park, where these populations are coming from. And then we need to think about what sort of management is going on. So at the plot size level, we need people managing for biodiversity. These farmers have to be thinking about what crops are going to promote biodiversity. Then we also need ecologists thinking on the landscape level. How can we have diversity between plots to facilitate the life cycles of all of these different species? Just to give you a brief overview of the ecology in Mumbai, again, Sanjay Gandhi National Park is the big one at the north end of Mumbai. That's where we're getting all of this biodiversity from. But there are also wetlands and some salt pans which promote a lot of biodiversity. And then, of course, we are looking at what can urban agriculture do to continue to support this network. Urban agriculture. So again, as I said, you need to think about where is it, how many plots do we have, and that's going to be part of our discussion. We need to think about diversity on plot level and landscape level. Something really important is that urban agriculture can really help connectivity, because it's a hard pitch to come to the city planners and say, okay, well, we really need some more habitat for the birds and the bees, because there's so much competition for land. But urban agriculture is so multifunctional, as all of you have been presenting on today. It increases food security. There are a lot of other ecological benefits and ecosystem services. So that multifunctionality makes it more viable. And of course, we need to think about trade-offs. What could this land be used for? If we're using it for urban ag, that means we're not using it for housing and other facilities. Also, if we're looking at it through an ecological connectivity perspective, that means that we're not taking into consideration economic factors, we're not taking into consideration social factors. So where we would recommend that urban agriculture plots are placed is purely from an ecological perspective. So we're flagging that for our partners, and we're saying here, from an ecological connectivity perspective, this is where we think urban agricultural plots should be placed, but it's not taking into consideration food security, economic prosperity. So those are something that they'll need to consider as they move forward.
So how do you measure ecological connectivity over a spatial area? This is a fundamentally spatial question. We're looking at a heterogeneous, super high density landscape where every single square inch has a use and every square inch of the city is owned by someone. So we started with a map of land use. This map was created by the Urban Design Research Institute in Mumbai. It is the best land use map available right now. It goes down to less than 1 by 1 meter resolution, which is extraordinary when you're looking at spatial information. It was put together for the 2014 to 2034 design plan by the Mumbai City Development Authority, and it has 27 different classes of land. So every chunk of the city is divided into one of those 27 land uses. They built it based off of satellite models. They looked at satellite imagery, and they extremely high density pixelage satellite imagery, and then they had ground crews to go ahead and truth that on the ground, enormous survey teams, and then they actually distributed these to citizens to try and categorize where informal boundaries were. So people could call into a hotline and say, actually that may be what the official ownership of the land shows, but that's not where the real property boundary is. So this shows property boundaries, it shows administrative boundaries, it's got transport networks, and it's got basic land uses, including, most important to us, open spaces and natural areas, which are characterized by indigenous biodiversity. We took this and we took 23 maps. There are 23 wards in the city, and we stitched them all together and made this really insanely high resolution land use map. But that does carry with it some assumptions that we had to make, and there were 4 of those. First, that the land use classification represented on our map is actually representative of ecological connectivity for the species in question, independent of actual land cover. So to unpack that a little bit, you might have yellow on there as residential. You might have a residential area where there's a very small house, a lot of trees, and a ton of vertical complexity in what plants are there. You might have some ground cover, shrubs, trees that would harbor, that would serve as habitat to harbor a lot of different biodiversity. You also might have a green space that is just a stark, heavily pesticide-ridden field that really doesn't harbor anything, including worms, insects, etc. Number 2, the land use map is sufficiently detailed to capture barriers and pathways within the urban ecosystem. It may look like this green space is great, but if it has a fence all the way around it, there are some species, mammals for example, that are not going to be able to move through that, whereas others, insects for example, couldn't make it across a 5-lane highway, whereas a bird could. So those are 2 inherent ones. The resolution of this is pretty good when you look at what we created in this program called ArcGIS. There were 2.5 billion cells, each one a little bit less than a meter. So we did have to resample a couple times. We got it down to about 880 million. That's still a very high resolution data set. So we took each of those cells and we assigned them a value. Those values are based on basically a review of the literature that shows that in biophysically, climatologically, and ecologically similar regions, it would take kind of representative biodiversity a certain amount of effort to move across one of those cells. So for example, natural areas, national park, urban green areas, those have high value. Those have low values, excuse me. It's easy to move across them. Industrial areas, big 4-lane highways, 8-lane highways, those are hard to move across, they're gonna have high values. So assumption number 3, those cost values assigned to each cell, each parcel of land, are representative on average for all species of concern. That's a big assumption, but it is one that has been represented over and over in the literature, and it's one that's pretty well accepted in connectivity literature. Minor species within the ecosystem have similar barriers and pathways as the major species. So again, we're looking across all of biodiversity. That's what our partners asked us to do. That's a big task, but this is a pretty good approximation, and it's very well supported. So finally, what we did. Those pink lines, those are moving across each cell. If you kind of move from one patch, which is, for example, Sanjay Gandhi National Park in the bottom right, up to that wetland up there in the top. As you move across each cell, you add up the values and you try to find the least cost path. So it's the path with the least basically added value. It's the easiest way for animals to move. So across this gigantic 880 million pixel thing, you've got from every cell within a national park or a green space to every other cell, this really insanely complicated thing that we decided not to show you because it doesn't make much sense. But the idea was to indicate what regions of the city are very well connected. Those are regions that are going to have a ton of these lines moving through them, and regions that are not well connected, which have no lines and are really hard for species to move across.
Okay, moving on this side. So, yeah, I'm going to sort of discuss how this ties back into urban agriculture and thinking about those sort of perspectives on it. But first, I wanted to show like a really zoomed in version of what Michael just talked about. And looking at the fact that even without these paths drawn, you can sort of identify some of the barriers as well as potential throughout the city for developing this ecological connectivity. As you saw in his map, red, and as he mentioned, is a pretty common barrier. But there's green sort of mixed everywhere in here. So you can't necessarily see it, but there's some really small dots, as well as these big ones. And it sort of gets you a planner to start to think about where these things might be able to go. And another point I wanted to mention was this variation in scale. He said we have a very high resolution, and if you zoom out just a little bit, you're going to lose a lot of this small scale resolution, which there might be benefits from one or the other. We went with this because we thought the high resolution was best for the beginning. And then quickly, the distinction between this locally managed biodiversity and that concept of ecological connectivity. Urban agriculture is a managed ecosystem. You're gonna have a different concept behind what's in natural areas. And I wanna mention that before we go into the rest of the discussion. And then also, as Yari mentioned at the beginning, this concept of social and political perspectives might want us to look at certain areas, even though we look generally at everywhere equally. So it's all things to consider in this discussion. So urban agriculture, there's no one necessarily that's focusing right on the Mumbai city, but the Mumbai metropolitan region has had a study looking at all the different agricultural types, and this is from there. It looks at the different types of plots as well as the different outputs of those plots. And so really we're saying that railway gardens, terrace gardens, and balcony gardens are what we're going to see popping up in a city most likely like Mumbai. And then perhaps some community farms or backyard gardens might fall in this category. But as you can see, vegetables is really the dominant form in these, as well as some fruit and flowers. One more thing on this one. So fruit and flowers and vegetables, it gets to about, if you look at the total sum, the common is about 30 species or less. And if you think back to Yari's picture in Sanjay Gandhi National Park, there's about 1,000 species of plants. So that really captures sort of the level that you're going to be able to get to when you're considering biodiversity, when you're managing it on such a reduced scale of number of species. So, all right, so the urban agricultural implications of our study. The community shared plots will improve potential for biodiversity. As we just saw in that last slide, farms were able to produce a diversity of crops that weren't found perhaps on terrace gardens. So the bigger plot size, the more people working on it, the more biodiversity you'll have just of your managed plant species, as well as larger plots in general are better for supporting faunal diversity that might appear there. And so on top of that, locating agricultural near parks and other natural areas is a way to, of course, increase the connectivity and allow migration of animals more easily, closer to the parks and less barriers in between. We do want to consider the integration of some large crops, such as trees, of space permits, because that expands a whole different level of faunal biodiversity that might be able to take advantage of that site, birds and butterflies and different things that are also important for agriculture. And then preserve and expand linear plots. So railway gardens, this is a picture of one. We don't really capture them in our map, but they do have potential, especially for these corridor pathways that might not be necessarily self-sustaining biodiversity, but they're very useful ways for animals to migrate through a system. So right, the future goals, considering these things in mind, first, these points seem kind of similar, but determining the relative values of different agricultural sites really gets to this map. So saying if you have certain places are much more important for this connectivity issue. We want to be able to identify those, but the least cost path doesn't necessarily identify those. And then we want to incorporate a more diverse classification of green spaces. So making that distinction between the types of gardens and the types of crops that are grown on those areas. And then policy, which was really what our ecological partner at Sanjay Gandhi was interested in, how we might consider these things in this development plan and things like that. So first, considering land tenure for existing plots is an important concept as land use value is so high and places are constantly expanding. We can automatically say that we can try to preserve that, increasing the value. And then including community gardens and slum rehabilitation plans that are going on, focusing on developing plots within those spaces, and then investing in multifunctional green spaces. So parks that are being built, you can add a garden onto. That might increase the value of that land. And then also, this is a map of the broader area. As you can see, this is where we studied. Very, very built up, but it's important to consider this ecological connectivity and biodiversity with the larger picture. A lot more agricultural land and a lot more forest land exists outside of Mumbai, which is an important aspect of this concept.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, any questions?
One question. So with the results of your least cost path analysis, were you able to select like particular sites that it would really help connectivity if this site had a green?
Yeah, so the least cost path analysis shows more areas of the city. So because of where the lines are drawn, so like some lines go like this up to the park and they're like avoiding this huge area. So that means that parks along those lines are really important. So we can't, if we were to take it to the software that Michael showed at the end with the red dots, that would do that, but that would be a next step. So that's an open source software that our partners could use in the future, given the map that we've created for them. But ours shows more like general areas of the city. This area is really important parks for connectivity. This area doesn't have a lot of least cost paths going through it, so it would be a good candidate for urban agricultural plots.
You know, it's, I think it is really good that you were paying attention to what your partner was looking for, and you know, biodiversity values were what they were interested in. But I'm just wondering. I mean, I think as a researcher, it's your opportunity too to say, here's some other things that you should be thinking about in addition to biodiversity. Do you have some sense of, after looking at your land distribution there, of other values that are likely to be a benefit to the city in those spaces?
Yeah, I think we had a lot of the things that you can draw from the other presentations today, considering hydrological connectivity. I mean, stormwater is a huge one for places like this. As a part of climate change in particular, you saw it's located on the coast. They're going to have sea level rise that they're dealing with, as well as increased rainfall variability. So flooding is definitely a concern for the city, and the more green spaces and high infiltration areas that you can develop have a large impact on built infrastructure not being overwhelmed in the coming years. So that's a big one. We've conversed with them about seeing how they would like to consider that. But
yeah,
you know.
I mean, it's fascinating to see trade-offs, because it may be that agricultural sites in parts of the city, some parts of the city, would be more effective for flood mitigation,
Right.
whereas in different parts of the city is where you'd have benefits from biodiversity. So it's interesting, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And in our discussions, it came up, for example, on the southeast side of the city, you've got a lot of mangroves that provide a lot of mitigation against storm surge, for example, but those areas aren't necessarily valued for urban agriculture specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And so in those discussions, we came up with obviously economic value of land and how that varies across the city, because the toe of the city, which actually does have relatively good connectivity values, is also the most valuable and the most built up. So those may be the most threatened. So a map of land use value, which is not actually publicly accessible, would also be a really cool one.
Yeah, in the back.
And also, if it's just for the purpose of biodiversity, I think even having green space or growing other things different from crops or agriculture will also be good enough. And then in terms of just urban agriculture aspect, what exactly are valuable to grow and to better preserve biodiversity or the connectivity? What choice of crops and how you arrange them to help?
Yeah.
Have you thought about that?
Yeah, that's huge. That wasn't part of our analysis, but when you're talking about connectivity, it's really not fair to just look at it from a map perspective, because we can say that this is a green space on our map, but if it doesn't have a lot of good vegetational structure and a lot of a high diversity of crops, then it's not doing as good of a job as it could to promote connectivity. And it's really a two-way street. So if we improve biodiversity at the plot level, we're going to be helping biodiversity like across the whole city and in the national park. But also, if we improve biodiversity on the landscape level, you're going to help increase the productivity of each agricultural plot. So it does go both ways, and it's an important consideration that there really needs to be more integrative management from farmers on the plot level and ecologists on the landscape level. They need to start talking to each other everywhere.
Yeah, Brittany.
It seems like biodiversity is really a kind of new co-benefit in discussion of urban agriculture, to have attention focused on that benefit. Did you get a sense for how urban planners in Mumbai or broader urban policy is thinking about biodiversity? Is that relevant to the plan?
Yeah, it's not currently, and that's why the people in so for example, in this national park, they predominantly argued that biodiversity is one of the biggest values of keeping that land in a national park, and yet squatters have been moving in. There are tens of thousands of people that have tried to move in there because it looks like good land to live on. And so they are hoping to use this kind of thing as an argument to those city planners and to the people who are putting together the long-term development plans to say, look, we can factor this in without too much economic impact or whatever, and we have these areas that are targeted for biodiversity, and they want to introduce that as something new and a new variable that has not been there historically.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of how creating like the stepping stones using urban agriculture compares to creating the stepping stones as like traditional green space as a connectivity approach?
Yeah, there's not a lot of research. Definitely, like urban ecological connectivity is like there's not a ton of research on it, and there's not like so very small sliver of that small section is on urban ag, but the potential seems great because a lot of times green spaces will be considered like soccer fields, which aren't typically very strong in biodiversity, but given all the things we're learning from agroecology and organic farming and talking about the benefits of biodiversity in those systems, applying those to urban agricultural plots and looking at how if we do use those tactics and we increase biodiversity for the purpose of increasing food production, then we're looking at a win-win situation.
Value to the species that are moving of a space that they can use as a stepping stone or a corridor or whatever is counted in what resources they can get at what point in their life cycle from that plot of land, and from an area like Gary just said that's managed for recreation. They're not going to get very many of those necessarily unless it's carefully managed for specific flowers to be there at different times and for nectar resources and whatever they need. Whereas, again, agriculture can do a lot better at that because that's what they are made for. They're made for food for us, and some of that can, in kind of a byproduct way, go to those animals.